be here. Super nice to be here. It's a kind of nuclear experiment, to have so many people from so many different fields compacted into one day, as if there would be some kind of explosion, which would be great. Like Beatrice, I'm representing the Architects Union, and the question is like, why architecture? If you take the most, and then the question would be, well, what is architecture? Maybe architecture is, for example, a structure by which we can live together, where we would mean human, first of all, so maybe buildings, cities, and so on. But we live together could also be to live with technology, to live with more than human, to live with the past, to live with the future. In other words, an extraordinary, to live with bacteria may be the most important. How to live in this more complicated sense. Again, you may wonder, like, well, where is architecture in this? Even if you take the simplest understanding of architecture, let's say a kind of like enclosure or a building, you would have to think of the architecture that belongs to the tubes, the cylinders, the rooms, the buildings, the complexes, the cities, the infrastructural circuitry of the nuclear world. Like at the most simple definition, it's a huge set of spaces. You would have to also think of this cycle that goes all the way from extraction through refining, through reactors, through cooling, venting, reprocessing, distribution, and finally returning some of the nuclear so-called waste to the earth. And you would think all the way along about the architecture that's necessary for this to take place. Not the architecture that's added to it or represents it, but the architecture that makes it possible. So again, architecture as the possibility of living together. If we want to bring this together with the nuclear, we have to bring together the architecture that makes nuclear possible with the architecture that makes, let's say, life possible. In almost all of those cases that we talk about so far, architecture is primarily prophylactic, is primarily containment at every possible scale. Containment and separation, distancing. And again, you say, well, what could architecture really do with that? Actually, to containment and hiding, the architects, we are experts at that. Architects have only one expertise, which is to hide complexity and to produce a kind of plausible image of simplicity that allows complexity to continue, frightening complexity. So containment, it's a little bit our thing. Hiding things, a little bit our things. The invisible is our natural material. We work always architecture. If you want to, by the way, if you want something and you know what you want, you don't ask an architect. Right? They're actually not very good at offering answers to questions. You ask an architect into the conversation, including this conversation today, when you don't know what the question is. And the architect kind of imagines a possible question. So maybe one way to consider this is to consider the possibility that there is a kind of architecture that makes possible not only nuclear energy, but all of the kind of psychopathologies that surround it. And like Beatrice, I would like to focus on, let's say, between 1945 and Japan and 1979, 3 Mile Island accident. So a kind of period going from a kind of pessimism and dystopia to a kind of euphoria, optimism, back to a kind of pessimism, but in reality an incredible cycle between dystopia and utopia. And again, I would like to ask you to think about the possibility that the period from 45 to 79 is sort of like a lens through which you can consider what's happening with the nuclear and with architecture, just a kind of lens. And we're going to go so fast that it's not going to be plausible. But we'll start with a landscape architect on the left. And by the way, maybe the question of the nuclear is a landscape question more than it is, let's say, an architecture question. This is Alfred Caldwell, who was both a student and a colleague of Ludwig Hilversheimer and Mies van der Rohe, who were teaching at IIT Institute of Technology in Chicago. 1 month after the bombs in Japan, Caldwell calls Hilversheimer and says, "What do you think?" His mentor. And Hilversheimer said, "It's all over. Everything is finished." Caldwell immediately wrote an article which was published in December 1945, in which he said basically, it's astonishing that we are as a species able to control the primary energy of the universe, but we cannot provide a safe house, and makes this very, I think, important observation that from that moment of 1945, destruction has become the new house, has become the new domesticity. So the question from that point on is, how do you live inside destruction? Hilversheimer immediately responds, and Hilversheimer is, of course, at the center of thinking about a kind of dispersal of architecture as the only possible defense. He's writing in 1949 that in the world of the atomic bomb, city concentrations can only be preparation for human suicide. And on the right is his proposal of how to deal with the atomic bomb. And notice that the appropriate response, the architectural response to an atomic bomb is to explode architecture. So we actually have to manufacture another explosion of architecture and distribute it across continental USA and the world, and the idea being that everybody within the circles will be killed. So in other words, what he's doing is to defend against this, you just multiply the number of circles and therefore minimize the number of casualties. With the H-bomb, he had to recalculate, and in response to this article in the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, in 1959, he redrew the map on your right, in which all of the urban concentrations should now be 20 miles apart, because this means that any one bomb would only kill 30,000 people and would severely ruin the lives of whoever happened to be in the wind path of that. So it's a kind of, let's say, architecture of destruction. Again, I would say this is an image of destruction as a new kind of house. It's not a matter of making a house to survive that. It's actually about a matter of making houses in which you die. Second example, Buckminster Fuller, always photographed with a dome in the background, his own head famously being understood as a kind of a dome. The dome in the background, 67 World Fair, is meant to be, as it were, coming out of his head. He observed that the atom bomb, and this is of course the document that spies gave to the Russians in order to produce their own bomb. This is the sketch of the American concept of a sphere within a sphere within a sphere. So Fuller notes that spheres make possible the atomic bomb, that the bomb itself is exactly that. This is the first one, right? That the effect of the bomb is a sphere, and that the only thing that survived the first tactical use of a bomb was a sphere. So he notices that on the roof of this building. So he basically argues that the best thing to make to deal with the atomic bomb, for example in 1959, is to make a sphere that would cover Manhattan. So in other words, and which you can see looks like a nuclear explosion. This is meant to be the defense against a nuclear explosion. This is 1 mile high, just to give you a sense of the size of this. If it's 1 mile high, then it's almost infinitely thin. Fuller's philosophy is to do more and more with less and less until eventually you can do everything with nothing, and at that point architecture would disappear. So he has an aspiration towards invisibility. This is architecture on the way out, but it's also kind of a, let's say, nuclear defense. This is no accidental image. On the left is the official government report on the Bikini bomb, where in order to make understandable the forces at work, they place it against Manhattan. On the right-hand side, 1950, Collier's magazine is visualizing what it would mean an atomic bomb in Manhattan, and you see it's uncannily similar to the dome that Fuller produces. Fuller's very first kind of a project as a teacher is to ask the students to imagine that people have to evacuate from their houses in cities because of a nuclear catastrophe. Everything needed to produce a house needs to be able to put into a container that could be put on a truck to take you somewhere else. You need then a shelter for that, and he invents for the first time the so-called necklace dome. So he imagines a kind of shelter from nuclear catastrophe, which is a lightweight frame with a kind of portable package for standardized living. It requires analyzing domesticity and finding every element of domestic life and making a kind of package for that. What's less well known is he immediately folded up that package and took it and displayed it in the courtyard of the Pentagon. The very first place he tried to promote the project was to the Pentagon before he famously took it to Black Mountain College. And you see on the left is the first time a plastic skin is placed on that very same dome. And you see he's inside that once again with this thing radiating out of his head. So here he is at Black Mountain College along with all the artists with his little package in his hand and his dome on the right, not telling everybody that it's simultaneously a military weapon and it's a kind of defense against the military. Or to say what I said from the beginning, and I'm only going to say the same thing like 100 times and you're already at number 25. There's no difference between defense against atomic warfare and shelter from atomic warfare because the very concept of shelter has been what has been exploded by the bomb. 1953, he exhibits in the Museum of Modern Art the latest version of that very same house. You see it here. Again, he gazes in astonishment at his own brilliance, and he says to Time magazine, so this is not a kind of esoteric discussion in private discourse. This is the most public discourse possible in the Museum of Modern Art. He says this is an appropriate atomic shelter. This is the very same year that he had been commissioned to make the radomes, which were at the absolute epicenter of the United States defense against intercontinental ballistic missiles. Again, what better to house radiation, the radar, than the radome, the dome. So again, is it attack, is it defense? It's both simultaneously. Second example, in the very same room where Fuller and his students, and there was never a project of Fuller that was not a student project, which then had his name attached to it. Likewise, Conrad Waxman in the very same room in Chicago at IIT, which, as you know, is a child of the Bauhaus, so the new American Bauhaus through Moholy-Nagy. Here's Waxman and his students mystified about what they have produced, which is, of course, this astonishing hangar, which is almost 1 mile long, which is one of the single most influential projects in the history of 20th century architecture. Less well known, you can see lurking down in the ground level there what seem to be quite small, or actually the largest military aircraft ever produced, the B-36, which is designed to be able to almost permanently move around the globe and drop atomic bombs on any place. In other words, this extraordinarily influential project, which describes itself as very well shielded against defense because it's a nothing building. There are no floors, no roof, no ceiling, no windows. There's nothing of architecture left, just a system that if you put a bomb through that system, it's easy, you can rebuild it. The whole thing can be built by labor with a single hammer, right? So there is the idea of a kind of, again, a self-explosion of architecture, a kind of internal dematerialization in order to make old-fashioned warfare seem irrelevant, but it's a center of a nuclear attack. As you can see in the very first image published of this project, which was, again, an Arts and Architecture magazine, the same magazine that Beatrice is referring to, and you can see the ghostly shadow of these weapons of death housed by this non-house, which is a kind of a space frame. These, Buckminster Fuller and Waxman, are probably the two most influential figures in the experimental architectural tradition that goes through the late 50s, 60s, and early 70s. I choose to show you only one aspect of that, which is Japan, because of course nowhere else was the intimacy of dystopia and utopia felt more clearly than Japan. Here is Conrad Waxman teaching a group of students in Tokyo in 1955. Sitting alongside him is Kenzo Tange, the famous architect in Japan. 3 or 4 of those students will become known as the metabolists by 1960. 1955 is the year in which Kenzo Tange's project on the right to domesticate the horror of the so-called peace park. So this image on the right, based on this original, this is 1945 to 1955. This is the moment which Waxman is talking. 2 of the students that are students of Waxman had just edited this issue, which is a 10-year survey of architecture in the atomic age in Japan, which culminates with an interview between one of the would-be metabolists and a nuclear physicist about the relationship between architecture and nuclear energy. In other words, this conference was actually being held in the very conference we're having today was being held in 1955, just as Waxman arrives. And the result for this, the first project that comes out of the metabolist, this is Kikutaki's Floating City. Why Floating City? Because the American Atoms for Peace project, including using nuclear weapons for architecture. So if I could blow up a mountain, then I would have a space to make a building. So they did a lot of experiments on how to use nuclear weapons as a kind of architectural device. The second proposal of that operation was to take away a mountain near Tokyo in order that Tokyo could expand. Kikutaki rejects that and instead offers this floating city, but this floating city is also using wave power, and the wave power is putting electricity into these columns, so these are vibrating with energy, but it also has a nuclear reactor. So in 1960, reacting to the atomic bomb and to nuclear energy is simultaneously this kind of defense and appropriation of the energy source. 1963, the first survey of what we would now think of as the experimental tradition in architecture is by Michel Rigon, and a huge part of his book is devoted to nuclear energy. He goes through all of the dystopia, all of the potential of suicide, but then goes through all the possible magnificent uses of nuclear energy, including using weapons to construct new kinds of city, and ends up with the conclusion that perhaps we will all be given at birth our own nuclear reactor, which will have sufficient capacity to be with us for the rest of our lives. So he simultaneously goes from the kind of horror of these weapons to the possibility that they are literally the kind of basis of domestic life. But in the book, he carefully maps how projects like the one on the right enable a new kind of architecture to be possible. Buckminster Fuller himself was not going to miss out, so when he did his tetrahedral city for Japan, his client was in fact the person responsible for bringing nuclear energy through a relationship with the United States to Japan. So of course this triangle has its own nuclear reactor. And this is, by the way, as published in Playboy, I think. I can give you endless examples. Returning to Domus in Italy, 1969. This is a city for 1 billion people, which is nuclear powered. So let's say that generation of architects that's arguing for the overthrow of everything of the past. Remember Fontana, Lucio Fontana in 1951 in Milan has told a meeting of the mafia of modern architecture, including Le Corbusier and Gideon and all the others, that every concept of modern architecture was destroyed by the atomic bomb. So an entire new thinking is resulting. So that generation that is doing this thinking themselves are nuclear powered. So the reaction to the nuclear weapon is in fact like that. Again, this is Kenzo Tange himself, which by the way in 1959 is teaching at MIT in Boston and is speaking loud and long about the beautiful qualities of nuclear energy. This is the person responsible for the planning after Hiroshima, somebody who lost a number of his family, as did the metabolist, is then making a city with Frei Otto for Antarctica, which has its own kind of nuclear reactor. Essentially what's happening is that nuclear energy is acting as a kind of prosthetic that enables architecture to occupy different spaces, underground, underwater, the moon, the future, the past, in different ways. But it's a kind of prosthetic amplifier of an existing human species. In other words, it fits into a kind of much more 19th century understanding of technology. And just want to be careful that you are not left with a feeling like there were these kids running around with nuclear energy in the 60s and 70s. This is 1956. This is Frank Lloyd Wright presenting his mile-long skyscraper in which the elevators are, as he said, atomic powered. And so basically the atomic power is enabling this building to be much taller than ever. This building is extraordinary in 56. And it's a kind of, and you could say, well, it's just a kind of imagination, but it's literally a kind of, you could almost say in the most literal sense, a kind of prosthetic expansion of human arrogance. Maybe here a more complicated example, Paolo Soleri, a really awful person, by the way. I had the disadvantage of meeting him in New Zealand, but truly horrible person, megalomaniac. But here in 1965 are the early versions of his Arcosanti project, and you can't quite see it, but in the bottom there's a nuclear power reactor in the base. But you see above is a Buckminster Full-like dome to protect yourself against radiation, and you see even written in there is the H-bomb blast. So he's visualizing the arrival of a kind of negative radiation from above and a defensive system, but what you're defending is itself atomic power. Again, just to make sure we're not with stereotypes, this is Drop City, the very image with all their bucky-full of domes. This is the very image of counterculture. They wanted their own nuclear reactor. Right? In '69, they said, we want our nuclear reactor. Okay, very fast, because all of this presupposes that nuclear energy was a kind of architectural prosthetic. It was not like added to architecture, but it was architectural in its quality and as it were expanded human vulnerability and human violence. Here, of course, is the beginnings of the Arte Nuclear group, right, more or less right where we are, and you see Enrico Barge, Joe Colombo, and Daniela, and they're making in 1951 this image on the right, which, as you can see, is a kind of confusion of a representation of sort of nuclei and sort of spinning microparticles that are also a representation of the mushroom cloud, which are also a representation of some kind of being. This is exhibited in the very first exhibition of the group in 1951, before they are even named as such. This is Joe Colombo, 1952. On the left, he's representing the shadows of Hiroshima, where a dead person is, the only trace of a dead person is coming from the shadow of the blast. And then he's doing images like the one on the right, where these kind of post-nuclear figures or nucleated figures are, as it were, almost underneath a tree that is itself, of course, a kind of atomic reaction, and is itself some kind of being. And then he's producing images like this, which are a confusion of all of the above. So nuclear explosion as a new kind of animism, as a new kind of life. That is then turned into the cover of the 1952 exhibition. And you see on the right that in that exhibition of the nuclear, Barge has made two kind of post-nuclear sculptures of figures, new kinds of post-humanoids. And the shadow behind them, the nuclear shadow, is being painted by Joe Colombo, who's a painter at that time. And look at one of those Colombo paintings. This is prefiguration, in which the atomic clouds have started to form a kind of organism, which is also at the same time a kind of architecture. And in this image, very beautiful, he's making at that time, probably you know, he's making films with Enrico Barge, which are all about a kind of new kind of fluidity. It's almost like images of what came after architecture. And he calls this one architectures, not architecture singular, but architecture. So you're looking at whatever it is that post-nuclear architecture would be, or not really post-nuclear, nuclear architecture is exactly that. And in 1952, he starts to do his so-called nuclear city. You see it here, which has some of those kind of blobby qualities. Most of the city is underground. and the spheres are up, but actually it's more complicated. On a good day, you move your sphere up into the sunshine, and when there's a nuclear attack, you come back down, so a little bit sort of mixed meat. And then it's a sectional city. This is Milano. You recognize the cathedral and so on. So it's a new kind of urbanism that floats up there where there's a lot of vulnerability, but has the capacity to go deep down. By the way, of course, he immediately stops being a painter, stops being a kind of thinker in that way, and via the figure of Asger Jorn, there's a direct relationship to Constant Nieuwenhuis's New Babylon. More or less 1959 is the first image of this city of the future, which is atomic power. There are atomic reactors, but they're kept at some distance from this life. Again, what you're supposed to see in this image in the bottom, the first plans in the first section drawn in the Situations International Journal, is that there is no architecture as you would be familiar with. Again, very influenced by Conrad Waxman, just to complete the orbit. Looking into it, I hope it's easy to understand this is a kind of internal explosion of architecture in which any assumption you would make about what is a space, but also what you would imagine as a species. Constant said, I cannot represent the human because one doesn't know what the human would want for itself and whether it would be in any way human. And he also observed there's nothing really human about humans. Humans are the single most sort of obnoxious species on the planet. Only when a child of a friend of his was sexually molested and the Vietnam War did he conclude that this was not paradise, but this would be a horror show, this would be Goya, this would be just mass. He did lots of images, very Goya-esque, called Massacre, where he would show the human species, if allowed to make itself anew, in collaboration with new technologies and new species and so on, would be murderous. This would just be filled with blood. So he runs away from the project. Not by accident, when Asger Jorn and Guy Debord make a manifesto in 1963 against underground life. Their argument is the call to go underground is a kind of fascistic call from government. One should resist this idea of shelter and, as it were, get one with the fact that we're not the same. Not by chance, this is advertised for a new magazine that we're going to do called Mutant. So there is some idea of a kind of mutation of architecture and a mutation of architectural sensibility. Just because I promised you to get as far as 3 Mile Island, this is Claude Perron, one of the heroes of the experimental group, again, making this kind of nuclear-powered urbanism. From 1974 on, he's doing the actual projects for the domestication of the imagery of the nuclear plants and these are not like idealistic, these were built, right? So I'm just showing you the kind of drawings. So one of the experimental avant-garde becomes responsible literally for domesticating nuclear energy. He is disowned by the experimental tradition. Nobody wants to have anything to do with him because this has happened. So 3 Mile Island has produced this kind of sharp sense that any kind of love affair with the nuclear is toxic and toxic for experimentation. To conclude, basically the idea is that between 45 and 79, there's an extraordinary depth of thinking about the nuclear, which is not, okay, now the architect should join the conversation. It's a kind of understanding to what extent that was architectural. This is the drawings that Fuller was doing in order to produce the first dome. This is 1947. The drawings are only atomic, described as atomic, are very strictly based on mathematical arguments that he thinks are based on his own readings of Einstein. He's kind of calculating, if you read the text more thoroughly, you will see. So this is happening a long time before nuclear weapons. He then is able to imagine a dome, the one on the right, and his very first description of this house is atomic bulkalo. That's a typical, instead of bungalow, bulkalo. It has low bulk, it's almost nothing, it's almost invisible. So he's finally figured out how to make architecture disappear, but he does so in the name of radiation, and he's of course, maybe you don't know, but he's arguing that we live inside electromagnetic vibrations. That is where we live. We perceive only an incredibly small part of it, so the architecture of the future is simply an architecture that understands the wider sphere. His very first project on the left, so those were drawings of the 40s. Let's go back to the 20s. This is a 27, 28 drawing of his very first Dymaxion house, which is called the 4D house because he was a close reader of Einstein, and this is imagining the house as kind of radiation in its form, and he always had cloud chamber images in his lectures and so on. You could say, yeah, but this is just architects kind of making a kind of science fiction. In fact, his first book of 1938 was mainly based on Einstein's relativity. The publisher thought he's an architect, it cannot be right. So it was sent to Einstein to review. Einstein liked it actually and invited him to meet, and they spent a good day discussing the book. Well, not so stupid, Fuller. And again, don't give Fuller too many credit points. Let's go back to Russia. Krutikov's imaginary architecture of the future, which he describes as powered by infra-atomic energy. All I'm trying to say is that at least from the 20s, there's a kind of response to Einstein. Again, Krutikov, a reader of Einstein, all of us would have this little capsule on the left. Cities would be made if our capsules would gather together. Is there any real difference between this project and the Metabolist project of the 1960s? No, right? You could only say that the difference is perhaps that in the 1960s, there's a possibility of saying, yes, there's an atomic reactor below, and yes, we've seen what atomic energy is. Back to Waxman, finally. This is Waxman, who was, in fact, the person who designed the summer house for Einstein. They talked about it a lot. Waxman always said to Einstein that there will be, from your theory, a new kind of architecture, a new kind of revolution in architecture. Einstein kept saying, no, I don't think so, and I kind of like my summer house just the way you made it, in wood by the water. Waxman was not convinced. 1947 at Princeton, the entire mafia of Gideon and Neutra and Alto and Frank Lloyd Wright, everybody gathered together to discuss the future of modern man, not the future of architecture, but the future of modern man. And Waxman said to them, it's all over, everything you ever thought, because of atomic energy. In other words, there is in architecture a deep, deep vein of reflection upon on the nuclear, not because, and before that, the atomic, not because they're trying to be cool or interesting, but actually because implied in the very logic of the nuclear is a kind of architecture, or at least a threat to architecture as thought. To finish with 1953 comment, in 1953, Lewis Mumford said, ever since this image was produced, architecture has always been, as it were, under the shadow of radioactivity. In other words, radioactivity has been, at least from the production of this image in the late 19th century, only possible to be thought there. So a little bit what I'm trying to say is it's so great to be here because I feel that all you have done by inviting us here is invite a kind of return to a conversation which started in the late 19th century, is extraordinarily urgent, was urgent then, and is perhaps even more urgent today. But as a historian, I have to say, hey, like Beatrice, let's look a little bit at where we've come from, because if the question of clean has come back, exactly what Ragon says is, he quotes Arnold Schein, one of the most important of the experimental architects, who says, in the future, nuclear energy will be clean. So this idea of cleanliness and of efficiency and of modernity that's now attached to, let's say, a new technique of nuclear production, this is likely to liberate all sorts of fantasies in the architectural domain, many of which will be incredibly stupid and not worthy of presentation at a lecture like this one. I hope it's clear that I think some of these are. Thanks.